obligatory for a speaker to say it's a pleasure to be before an audience. In my case, I have two specific reasons to be grateful and blessed. One, I suspect that many of you read my articles and watch me on TV, so the least I could do is come and thank you for helping to pay my salary. Secondly, I'm a Westerner, born in Arizona, grew up in California. I consider myself only an exile on the East Coast, and I have been energized and really excited to be in Colorado, one of my favorite states, because the beat of liberty is strong here, the beat of freedom is strong, and the beat of religious expression is very strong. And I can't thank you enough for lifting my spirits and also helping to educate me here. I'm going to give you the punchline first because of the recent news on the Supreme Court decision on Obamacare. You will hear over and over again one of two things. Either there is no voter fraud or it doesn't make a difference. Well, let me tell you what difference it just made in your lives. In 2009, the U.S. Senate passed Obamacare, overcoming a Republican filibuster with exactly 60 votes, the minimum required. They only got those 60 votes because of the resolution the previous July of a contested Senate race in Minnesota. Al Franken, the comedian, still is, even if he's in office, 6 months of court battles. They recounted 4 times. The Republican senator won 3 of those recounts, but lost the 4th. This is how it often works. It happened in Washington State. My friend Bob Williams is here to testify to that. He won supposedly by 317 votes, and after 6 months of the seat being declared vacant, he was sworn in and promptly provided the 60th vote. I have interviewed former Democratic senators, and I've interviewed staffers who tell me, without Al Franken's vote, there would have been nothing like Obamacare passing the U.S. Senate, then the House, and then being signed into law. Well, 3 months after he was sworn in, a citizens group called Minnesota Majority spent the money, went out and looked at all of the voting records, and discovered irrefutable proof that over 1,200 felons had voted illegally in the election, people on probation or parole. They had not yet had their rights restored. Now, because it's a secret ballot, we don't know for sure how they voted, but when a local Minneapolis TV affiliate went out and asked, 9 out of 10 said, I voted for Al Franken. You do the math. Al Franken was elected on the basis of illegal, fraudulent votes, and you have Obamacare because of it. And the Supreme Court closed that chapter just last Thursday. Don't ever have anyone tell you vote fraud doesn't make a difference in your daily life. Just ask yourself that the next time you're in a doctor's waiting room for hour after hour. Now for the storyline. We're going to play a game here called Connect the Dots. It's a story that's almost 50 years old, marches right up to the present day. Please follow me. There is a thread that runs throughout it. How many of you have heard of Saul Alinsky? Very well-educated group, the Chicago Radical, who invented community organizing. Well, in the 1960s, he was the cat's meow among the radical left. So much so that an impressionable young college student named Hillary Rodham became enamored of him at Wellesley, so much so that she wrote her senior thesis, 96 pages, on the Saul Alinsky model of community organizing. In fact, she compared him to Thomas Jefferson and Martin Luther King in her pantheon of heroes. She was so excited about Alinsky, she went and interviewed with him, and he ultimately offered her a job. She got a better offer, she didn't take it, but she wanted to work and be an Alinskyite. Saul Alinsky, as you know, was a man of, shall we say, very practical nature. He actually has been quoted as saying, in politics, all means justify the end. All ends justify the means. we do whatever we have to win. He dedicated his book, Rules for Radicals, to Lucifer, because he said, although Lucifer did not win his struggle with the Lord, he did win enough to have his own kingdom in the netherworld. Now, this was not a joke. He admired Lucifer as the first revolutionary. Now, we advance the Alinsky story to the late 1980s. A fellow named Barack Obama leaves Columbia University, moves to Chicago, a place he has no friends in, no relatives in, no ties to. He does so because he wants to work for Saul Alinsky's community organizing groups. Alinsky has since died. And Obama told the Washington Post, my best education came from those Alinsky organizations. In fact, he became the lawyer for Acorn. The lawyer, pro bono. For 5 years, he was their lawyer, defending them against allegations that they were manipulating voter registration records, engaged in vote fraud, cheating, not paying their employees minimum wages. Acorn, as you know, was completely corrupt. James O'Keefe finally revealed that they were so corrupt that they would give advice to someone posing as a pimp on how to bring in teenage prostitutes from El Salvador so they could be exploited. They finally collapsed. Some of them have reformed under new mismanagement. But Acorn was the group Obama chose to represent as their lawyer. And that's when he won his first victory in court. The motor voter law was the first bill that Bill Clinton insisted Congress pass when he became president in 1993. Even though there was record turnout in the 1992 elections, Clinton declared a crisis in voter turnout. We had to pass motor voter. What did motor voter do? It made sure that you could only register, you could register just by a postcard. You didn't have to prove your citizenship, didn't have to prove your address, didn't have to prove your age. All you have to do was sign. It further stipulated that people could register, and government agencies were required to encourage people to register at unemployment offices and welfare offices and driver's license offices. And lastly, it told the states, you can't remove people who are ineligible to vote because they're dead or out of state or for other reasons until many elections have passed. You have to keep them on the rolls, creating a large chunk of deadwood of voters that people can easily impersonate or manipulate or become a template, an indirect invitation for possible voter fraud in a close election. At the signing ceremony for the motor voter law in 1993 were two of Saul Alinsky's disciples, Francis Fox Piven and Richard Cloward. And Clinton acknowledged their role in passing this. Piven and Cloward are the originators of the Alinsky theory that the way to have revolution and to bring down the system is to overload the system. They advocated that everybody sign up for welfare. And because the standards were so loose in the 1960s, everybody did in New York City, and of course that helped bring the city to its knees and near bankruptcy in 1975. They are the originators of the chaos theory. You bring down the government by making sure it can't work. They applied that to voting. Richard Cloward told CBS News in 1996, it's on tape, a little bit of fraud isn't important if it means some people get to vote. Think about this. The brainchild behind the motor voter law says a little bit of fraud is okay if it makes sure we have more votes. It doesn't matter if they're eligible, we just want more votes. Barack Obama was challenged, Acorn was challenged in Illinois by the Republican governor who said, I'm not going to enforce this federal mandate. Obama and Acorn took him to court. Obama won a court victory. Barack Obama was the lawyer who brought us motor voter because it was the precedent that other states had to follow after that federal court victory by Obama. Move forward a little bit more. 2002, after the Florida meltdown, where Bush and Gore were virtually tied in Florida, lots of confusion. And the biggest problem in this issue is it's not just about voter fraud, it's about incompetence on the part of our election officials. You can't always tell where the incompetence ends and the fraud begins, which is why liberals so much like loosey-goosey election laws that they can manipulate behind the scenes so we never figure out what's going on behind the curtain. We passed the Help America Vote Act. It was a bipartisan measure. Chris Dodd, the Democratic senator, said the goal of this is to make it easy to vote and hard to cheat. We can do both. We're Americans. And it was a decent piece of legislation. But the left changed its mind on working in a bipartisan fashion on election law in 2008 because two things happened. The Supreme Court ruled that voter ID was constitutional, 6-3. The court's leading liberal at the time, John Paul Stevens, voted and wrote the opinion in favor of voter ID. And a couple months later, Barack Obama won the Democratic nomination for president. The Lacorns lawyer had reached the pinnacle. He, of course, knew that the way you win future elections is you change the rules, or you muddy the rules, or you fuzz up the rules. And with the Supreme Court decision, the left had to go into overdrive. And sure enough, as soon as Obama took office, strange things happened at the Injustice Department under that infernal general, Eric Holder. The new Black Panthers, you've heard about them, carrying billy clubs and weapons, intimidating voters at a Philadelphia polling station. They were let off the hook by the Justice Department, even though they basically hadn't shown up in court and were basically found guilty. Bartle Bull, the former campaign manager for Robert Kennedy, witnessed that incident and said it was the worst case of voter intimidation he'd ever seen, and he had been in the Deep South during the Civil Rights era. Julie Fernandez, an Obama official at the Justice Department, said, "We're not going to enforce the federal law that requires states to clean up their voter rolls if they get beyond a certain point, which is why we have hundreds of counties around this country where there are more registered voters than there are adults over the age of 18. We call that a clue that there could be a problem in the future." Then, in 2012, George Soros and his friends convened a meeting at the headquarters of the National Education Association in Washington. This was the strategy to capitalize on Obama's re-election victory. They agreed to spend $100 million on three things. First of all, end the filibuster in the Senate on judges so we would have more liberal judges. Check, Harry Reid did that. 2, make sure that we intimidate, crack down on, and otherwise discourage these new Tea Party groups. Now, they wanted to propose a constitutional amendment to overturn Citizens United. In reality, the job was done for them by something called the IRS. And we're now learning more and more about the IRS's cover-up in the tax-exempt scandal. And the third thing was crack down on any attempts to have voter ID laws, laws requiring people to prove their citizenship when they register to vote, and other voter integrity measures. And sure enough, you've heard it everywhere. These laws are racist, the return of Jim Crow, and there is no voter fraud. Just last week, I was in Akron, Ohio. Dennis Miller, a voter, came up to me and said, "I went to the ballot box the last time, the polling place, someone had already voted in my name. I couldn't do anything about it." Gave me an affidavit he'd given the election officials. Can't do anything. All the ballots are in one box with no name on them. In New York City, the Department of Investigations conducted a sting operation in November 2013. They sent out investigators to represent 65 voters who were ineligible. They were on the voter rolls, but they were ineligible to vote. They were either dead, serving in public housing on Rikers Island, the local prison, or they had moved out of state. 64 of them were able to vote, no questions asked, because there was no ID required. The one case where a voter was turned away, an investigator, the polling official looks at the name, looks up the record, looks up at him and says, "My son is the name you've given me. You're not my son." So that didn't work. That's the only time. What was the reaction of the corrupt Board of Elections in New York City? They sent a letter to the prosecutors in New York demanding that the Board of Investigations be prosecuted for fraudulently misrepresenting voters at the polls as part of their investigation. You can't make this up. Now, of course, we come to Hillary. The first policy speech Hillary has given. She's been silent on trade, she's been silent on entitlement, she's been silent on everything. But her first policy speech, what did she pick? Voting rights. In Houston, Texas, she gave a fire-breathing speech accusing almost all of the Republican presidential candidates you saw at this conference of trying to intimidate and prevent the young, the poor, and the old from voting. Well, here are her ideas for the future. Now, some would say these contravene state laws, the federal government won't have the right, but we've already seen what a president with an executive order pen can try to do. Automatic voter registration is her first goal. If you appear on any government list, you'll be automatically registered to vote. If you appear on more than one government list, and we're not even counting the NSA yet, if you appear on more than one government list, you're going to be registered many times. Some of you appear on government lists in more than one state. You own property in one state. You used to live recently in one state. You're going to be registered in both states. This is an organized recipe for chaos. Ultimately, it will mean anyone can vote because everyone is registered, including fictitious people. Felons. She wants to override the constitutional provision that states have the right to determine when felons regain the vote. She wants to make it nationwide reenfranchisement. By the way, I'm not supposed to use the word felons. Just like illegal aliens, you can't use that word anymore. It's not politically correct. We have a new word for felons. Are you ready? Returning citizens. So get your P's and Q's in order. Well, we all know how well those returning citizens served our democracy by fraudulently electing Al Franken in Minnesota and what that represented. The last thing she wants to do is have early voting for a minimum of 20 days nationwide. Now, I don't know about you, but the Constitution and the law that established a nationwide election process in 1882 by Congress says we have something called Election Day. I never knew it could become election month. Do you notice, by the way, that the one thing that's slower in our life, with all these smartphones and everything else accelerating everything, the one thing that's slower is getting the election returns. You used to look up the newspaper the next morning and figure out who won. Now the newspaper has almost no information in it because they have to count all these early votes by paper. She wants election month before the election day. Then we have election day. Then we have election month sorting out the votes and having, of course, the inevitable recount that they can jigger. What is it Scalia calls it? Jiggery-pokery. This is a recipe for disaster and confusion. We want people to vote, she claims, before the debates are even over in many states. And if you don't like so much money in politics, and you don't like all these consultants, and you don't like all these commercials, if you expand early voting to 20 days, you're going to have a lot more of that. We're giving people exactly what they don't like in politics in order to spread out the vote to make it easier to mobilize their soldiers and their troops to the polls. Now, this is what she'll be campaigning on. Her belief is she can intimidate the Republicans into silence on this issue, and too often she's been correct. You elected a good man, Secretary of State in Colorado last November, but ever since he's been inaugurated, it seems that his emphasis and his priority is internet voting, which comes up for a hearing on July 7th. Look, internet voting, when the Washington, D.C. city government created its electronic voting systems, they issued a challenge. If anyone can break in and change putative results in 36 hours, you get a prize. 4 graduate students from the University of Michigan broke in within 9 hours and changed everything. Somehow the prize vanished. The biggest fan of internet voting in the last decade was the late Hugo Chavez in Venezuela. He loved internet voting. It all comes to one central location, and there's a guy at the computer programming table. We don't want internet voting. It's certainly not yet. But that's the priority that your Secretary of State here in Colorado has. The hearing is July 7th, if you'd like to make your views known. The email, if you want to get out a pen, is elections@SOS, Secretary of State, SOS, which is the message you should send, help, sos.state.co.us, elections@sos.state.co.us. And that's part of the good news I want to leave with you. We can win this battle. Shoplifting is a big problem for retail stores. What retail merchants tell me is All you have to do is just a few things. An ounce of prevention is worth a pound of cure. Just a few things will stop voter fraud. A lot of it. Put up a sign that says violators will be prosecuted. Have a camera, it doesn't even have to be on, just have a camera in the corner. And have a security guard even if he's asleep near the door. Those three things cut shoplifting 35–40%. Just talking about voter fraud, letting people know that people are watching, joining groups like True the Vote, a group out of Texas which is nationwide that monitors elections, can stop a lot of voter fraud. Because there are a lot of people who'll do it if there's zero risk. There's some people who won't do it if there's just 5% risk of getting caught. Lastly, each and every one of you have more power than you realize. All of you have dozens or hundreds of names on your email contact list, friends, neighbors, relatives, business colleagues. Marketing people have told me, studies show, if you see a television commercial from a politician, on a scale of 0 to 100 of credibility and believability, it usually hits a 25, not very good. If it's from a company selling soap or something, it's 35. But if it comes from a friend, neighbor, relative, or business colleague, it's between 70 and 90. The messages you send out to the people you know, the links you send out, this is voter fraud, you need to stop this is what the Secretary of State is up to. You can build a word-of-mouth army because you can ask them, if you like this link, send it to your friends, neighbors, and relatives. And in conclusion, we can win this battle. They are losing almost every lawsuit they file against voter ID laws. 10 years ago, we had voter ID laws in 4 or 5 states that were really sufficient. Now we're up to about half the country, with 7 or 8 more states having partial voter ID laws. We can expand this. We'll never get to New York, we'll never get to California, where it's actually illegal for an election official to ask for an ID, believe it or not. But we can cover much of the country, almost all the country. And the reason we have to do this is not just because of candidates you might support, because voter fraud is not a partisan issue. There's still some Republican voter fraud. Talked to Mitch McConnell the other day. He says, yeah, there's still counties in Kentucky. My Republican judge friends will trade a fifth of bourbon for a vote. That's how valuable bourbon is in Kentucky. But it's also about our democracy. You have 2 civil rights. The first civil right, we fought a long struggle in the 1960s over to repair omissions in our national framework, our fabric. We fought a long battle to make sure people couldn't be blocked from voting, couldn't be intimidated from voting, couldn't be barred from voting by poll taxes or literacy tests. We made sure that people who'd been excluded were brought into the system. That was a good thing, a proud thing. We need to continue that tradition and continue to expand it. But each and every one of us has a second civil right. And that civil right is, if you vote, your vote can be canceled out, meaningless. If someone is voting who lives out of state, is a non-citizen, is dead, I don't believe in voting without respiration, or is a felon or otherwise ineligible, non-citizen voting is a real problem. Studies from the Old Dominion University show that 6% of non-citizens voted in the 2008 presidential election. 6%. John McLaughlin, a pollster, found that 13% of the Hispanics he just surveyed say they're not citizens and they voted. States like Kansas and Arizona and Georgia are trying to require proof of citizenship. After all, we heard from Katie Pavlich that if you register for a background check to get a gun, you have to show proof of citizenship. Why not for a vote? But the Obama administration is going to court and suing all of these states saying, you don't have to, we don't need no stinking rules. Just show up. New York City, where I live, you can't do this on the federal level, but cities have the right to allow non-citizens to vote in local elections only. It only happens in a few nuclear-free zones in this country. But Mayor de Blasio is very unpopular. He actually wants to go to the city council this fall and say that anyone who lives in New York who has valid legal residency papers, a green card, will be able to vote for mayor next time. This is his way of ensuring he wins the Democratic primary in the general election. This is a trend. They want to blur the distinction on marriage. They want to blur the distinction on health care between government and private. They want to blur the distinction on citizen and non-citizens when it comes to voting. But if we raise this issue and we raise these points, we can win. Because they're two civil rights. We've done well on the first. We have one more to go, and it's up to you to make sure we make the argument, because 75% of the people agree with us, including majorities of African Americans, Hispanics, and Asians. They are losing this battle if we fight it. Thank you so much, and if you want to see me at the book signing table, I'll be happy to chat with you. You don't have to buy anything, and thank you so much. Many of you in this room have been my sources for my books. They've given me stories on how to pursue this issue. I can't thank you enough, and let's look forward to another great Western Conservative Summit in 2017.